Welcome to the Greenhouse Education Research Complex here at Temple University Ambler. My name is Ben Snyder. I'm the manager of the complex here on campus. So today, as part of the Ambler Campus EarthFest Presents Science is Scary, we're going to be looking at some of the scary, weird, and unusual plants that can be found in our research and teaching collection here at the greenhouse. So walk inside, and the first plants we'll start to look at are carnivorous plants. So there are many different types of carnivorous plants. We'll look at two main types today. Ones that have active traps and ones that are more passive. So the first plant that we come to is a tropical pitcher plant, a Nepenthes. So you can see they have these very large, very colorful pitchers, which look really cool to us. They are very scary if you're a small insect. So these are an example of a passive method of capturing insects. So the insect will land on the top lip of the pitcher. There's a sweet nectar that's secreted there, which attracts the insects to the pitcher. Once the insect lands on that lip, it's very slippery and it falls inside. And then there's water contained at the bottom of the trap, which then drowns the insect. Once the insect is drowned in the liquid, there's essentially digestive juices and enzymes that the plant produces that will break down the insect, break down the exoskeleton, and the plant will absorb those nutrients through its cell walls. So there are a couple reasons that plants would choose to be carnivorous. So one of them has to do with the natural environments where these plants are found. Many of them come from very nutrient-poor areas. So for example, this is an epiphytic plant. So you can see it's just growing in a basket. There's not a lot of soil. In nature, this would be found growing on a tree, in a branch, really not growing in soil. So since it can't get nutrients from the soil, it has to rely on other sources to get those nutrients. Primarily, in this case, decomposed insects. These types of traps can produce very unique ecosystems and relationships with other animals. So there's certain tree frogs that will lay their eggs in these. There are spiders that will wait and essentially fish insects out of the trap to eat for themselves. So there's all sorts of very unique interactions that go focus around this plant. There's also a Butterwort, which doesn't really look all that exciting, but it gets the name Butterwort because the leaf surfaces are covered with a very sticky substance, which once insects land on it, they can't get off, and like the pitcher plant, it will secrete juices that then essentially digest the insect, and the plant absorbs the nutrients through its leaves. Right next to this is a plant that many of you are probably familiar with, the Venus flytrap. So the past two examples we looked at, the Nepenthes and the Butterwort, both of those use passive methods of capturing their insects. So essentially, the insect comes to the plant, and the plant digests it. In this case, with the flytrap, this is an example of active method of capturing insects. So each of these traps has trigger hairs that line it, and when an insect crawls across 3 or more of those hairs, it triggers the trap to close. That triggering mechanism that essentially prevents false positives for the plant, so it doesn't close unnecessarily and waste energy. But as I already gave away, once it's triggered, the trap will actually close and surround the insect, seal it off, and then once the trap is closed and the insect can no longer escape, then the plant also secretes digestive juices and digests the insect. After a few days, depending on the size of the insect, the trap will reopen, and it can repeat that process 2 or 3 times before essentially it wears itself out and dies, and a new trap has to be made. Because of that, it's not really good to essentially play with these. You don't want to close them without any insect or any food inside, because it wears the trap out and the plant gets no nutrients from it. Despite how exotic and unusual this plant looks, it's actually a hardy plant. It tolerates frost, and it is native to the Carolinas, a very small geographical area in the Carolinas, in wetland bogs and marshes. So we'll move on to the next plant, which is actually not a carnivorous plant, but also moves, which is kind of cool. So also on this bench is a sensitive plant, most of Utica. Another plant that you may have heard of or been familiar with. This one's just kind of cool in the fact that it is a plant that will move by itself. So when the leaflets are touched, they will fold up. Essentially, this is a mechanism to discourage herbivory from browsing animals. Because essentially, once it's triggered, it looks dead, and nothing wants to eat a dead plant. So you can just come over and touch a leaf, touch a leaflet. It all closes up, and the leaflets fold down, and the plant looks dead. So after about an hour or so, the leaflets will unfold again, and it'll be ready to do it all over. Okay. So the next plant that we're going to look at is probably one of our more famous or interesting plants in the greenhouse, especially when it comes time for science is scary and unusual plants. So this is one of our many giant quartz flowers, Amorphophallus titanum. Currently, this is the only one that is green. The rest of them are dormant, and this one is starting to go dormant, which is why it's starting to turn yellow and wilt. So giant quartz flowers, as you may have heard, Longwood just had a giant one flower earlier this spring and attracted very large crowds. So giant quartz flowers produce the world's largest inflorescence. So an inflorescence is a grouping of single flowers. It's not one single flower, but it's a large mass of flowers produced on one botanical structure, essentially. So this is the world's largest unbranched inflorescence. For purpose of this, what we'll call the flower can be up to 8 to 10 feet tall. Some of them have been taller than that, but that's a general height. So very, very large. And the other unique part of this, why it's called a quartz flower, is because when it is in flower, it smells like a dead body. It smells like rotting meat. So this is to attract its pollinators. So this plant is native to the Sumatran jungles and is pollinated by carrion flies, things that would essentially come and lay their eggs or feed off of rotting meat. So that scent helps attract the pollinators that are specific to this plant. The flower only lasts for about 2 days, and it takes a very long time to produce that large of a flower. It takes a lot of energy to produce an 8 to 10 foot tall flower, so the plant cannot do it very often. It needs time to recoup that energy before it can reflower. Ours have not flowered yet. They're grown from seeds, so they're going to take a few years to get large enough. Some of them are getting close. They're typically between 7 and 10 years old before they produce their first flower. Ours are 7 years. So in theory, we could have a flower at any time, so we'll see. But like I said, most of ours are currently dormant, so they go through growth cycles. Being native to Sumatra, they don't really have seasons there, so it's not based on calendar. It's based more on the maturity and the age of the plant. So the older the plant is, the longer between cycles, so it'll stay green for 12 to 14 months before dying back. Younger plants can go through multiple cycles in 1 year. So after they go dormant, once they turn yellow, the top dies back, and it retreats into a giant underground tuber or corm. So essentially, this is like a crocus ball. If any of you planted crocus in the spring or fall, this is pretty much the same botanical structure, only much larger. So this one that I'm showing you now weighs about 21 pounds. They've been known to weigh up to 200 pounds, so they can get very, very large. Some of our other ones are closer to 30 pounds. So again, that's another way you can measure probability of getting a flower. The heavier the tuber, the more likely we are to get a flower. So it'll be dormant in this stage for 3 to 4 months typically, but again, depending on the age of the plant, that will affect how long it's dormant. And then once it breaks dormancy, that point in the center will regrow and then start to turn into another giant leaf like this. So botanically, this is one giant leaf. So the part that looks like a trunk is called the petiole, and then at the top it's divided into a bunch of separate leaflets, but technically it's all one giant leaf. So they're very, very unusual plants. Very unique to see them in flower because it is such a rare event. So hopefully we will have one blooming here in the next few years that you can all come and see. Alright, so we'll turn around again and look at our next plant that's on our list. It's the tetrastigma. So it's this giant vine that's growing up and over everything. So you should see it goes up there, goes up to the roof. Yeah. So it's a very, very large vine. It's in the Vitaceae family or grape family. So it's related to grapes, related to Virginia creeper, things like that. It looks relatively unassuming, just a big green leafy vine. But it has one very interesting habit of it. That is it is the host plant for the Rafflesia flower. So the Rafflesia flower is the world's largest single flower. So the giant corpse flower that we just looked at was the world's largest inflorescence or group of flowers. This, the Rafflesia arnoldii, is the world's largest single flower. So if that's not strange enough already, just because of what it looks like and how large it is, that's up to 3 feet across, the Rafflesia is a holoparasite. So it lives its entire life inside a host and gets all of its energy from that host. And that host plant happens to be the Tetrastigma vinifera vine, which we have here. So for the entire life of the Rafflesia, it is sending essentially little shoots through the trunk of the Rafflesia, gathering nutrients that the Rafflesia is producing and using it to grow itself. The Rafflesia has no roots, stems, or leaves of its own. The only time it emerges out of the host plant, the Tetrastigma, is to flower, which is when it produces this very large maroon-colored flower. The buds of it look like a head of cabbage. It emerges from the roots of the Tetrastigma, so you'll see this popping out of the ground at the base of the vine. The flower will take 6 to 8 months to mature, and then it opens for 3 or 4 days and then closes. So like with the giant corpse flower, it is also pollinated by things that would be attracted to rotting meat, so it also has a very distinctive smell to it. So it helps attract its pollinators, flies, carrion beetles. There hasn't been a lot of work done about this, figuring out what exactly pollinates it, but it's believed it could be a certain type of shrew. So it's very odd. Again, not a lot of research has been put into this yet. There's still a lot of questions about how the Tetrastigma will actually inoculate or become a part of the Tetrastigma, how that process works. But again, this is also endangered just because of how rare it is, habitat destructions. This is native to Sumatra as well. So it's a very popular tourist plant, but easily destroyed. Alright, so getting away from things that smell like dead bodies and rotting meat, we'll go look at some other plants that are frightening in their own way. Some of our cacti and very prickly plants over in our succulent area. So this is a teaching greenhouse, so we maintain many different types of plants from all around the world. So we've already seen some of our jungle areas with the tropical pitcher plants and giant corpse flowers. But we also have desert and succulent habitat plants as well that students can learn from and study. So this bench can be very intimidating. There's lots of very prickly things in here. So right now these are some of our agave collections. Lots of different types of cacti. So as you see, this is a bench that you do not want to lean across without knowing what you're leaning into. So spines, there's multiple different purposes for spines depending on the species. Primarily, you would think defense against herbivory. Nothing wants to eat a plant covered in spines. That's a good way for the plant to protect itself. In many cases, that would be what the spines are for. Like in this quinchia that's in the front with these very long, straight spines. But some of the other spines are a little bit harder to figure out what the purpose is. So example would be this one here with all these white cobweb-like spines on it. Looks like a spider's web. It's actually plant-produced fibers that the cactus grows itself. So in this case, it is serves dual purposes. So the first purpose is sunshade. So everyone thinks cacti, they like full sun, they grow in the deserts. And while that's true, growing in full sun uses a lot of water, and there's not a lot of water in the desert. So one way that cacti can help protect themselves from excess water loss is to shade themselves. So this white filament-like fiber that the cacti produce can act as a shading mechanism to keep the sun off the body of the cactus. Another purpose that some of these cactus spines have, especially these long white ones, both of these are native to the Peruvian Andes, so high mountain areas where there would be fairly regular fog occurrences. It may not rain very often, but it wouldn't be uncommon to see fog rolling in early in the mornings before the sun burns it off. So these long spines actually help the cactus take advantage of these foggy mornings by collecting fog on the spines, which then condensates and runs down to the base of the plant, providing water for the plant. So there's actually indigenous cultures that have noticed this and then utilized it to make fog nets in these same climates where there's not a lot of natural rainfall or natural spring water, but consistent regular fog. They put up fog nets, which are just giant nets on the hillside. The fog will condensate on it and run into buckets, and they can use that for water. So essentially that principle is taken from natural examples like these cacti. All right. And then the last plant that we'll look at is on the other corner of the greenhouse, and is very unassuming just to look at it. Doesn't look prickly, doesn't have an odd smell to it. It's a normal plant, but it has a very unique relationship that, if you didn't know that, could make it rather scary to just go pick it up. So our last plants are these two in the front, Hymenophytum formicarium. There's really no common name. They're a fairly unusual plant you don't see very often. But you can see they have a very swollen stem. And these are still very young specimens. We just got these a couple of years ago. They haven't fully matured yet. But as they mature, that swollen stem will keep getting larger and larger. And eventually, that's where the unique symbiotic relationship that makes these plants interesting comes about. So these are known as ant plants or myrmecophytes. So they have symbiotic relationships with ants. And ants will live inside those swollen bases, so they're more or less hollow on the inside. They have small fiber supporting structures, but enough space that the ants can crawl around inside. So the ants will make giant colonies inside the base of these plants, and that protects it from herbivory. Another example of nothing wants to eat a plant that is full of stinging ants. So in that way, the plant provides a home for the ants, and then vice versa, the ants provide protection for the plant. The plant can also get some natural fertilizer from the droppings left by the ants on the inside of its stem. So there are other examples of ant plants as well. There are bromeliads that will have a swollen base. We have a couple of those on the other side of the greenhouse as well. This is a very unique symbiotic relationship that helps both parties. Ants get a home, and the plant is protected from herbivory.
Discover more at ambler.temple.edu/science of scary.